So let's jump right in. Let's jump right into React Router. And I don't know if you've worked with React at all, you probably know React Router. It's been the most important or most commonly used, I should say, routing library there is. I mean, we can have a quick look at the npm stats. So should make a difference, but let's grab the React Router DOM package, which is the one you typically use. Yeah, so that would be 11 million. Just React Router is 12 million. They're essentially the same, you could say. They're not, but they depend on each other. So yeah, 12 million weekly downloads is a lot. If you compare that to React, we can see React has 30 million or 31 million weekly downloads. So React Router is getting used a lot. And of course, like everything else in tech and especially in front-end web development, it has evolved over all these years. And the latest version now is version 7. They don't say it here on the site. Well, it's hidden here. So the latest version is version 7 now. And the good thing is that version 7 did not change everything. Your old React Router code, the one you wrote with version 6, should still work. There are only very few minor adjustments. In general, that code will still work and you can still use React Router the way you always did. And I just see it says 7 here. Easy to overlook, I guess. Never mind. So version 7 did not change everything. And then again, it kind of does. Because version 7 introduces framework mode. I'm not sure if it's the official name, but I'll call it framework mode. I think I also heard the React Router team call it framework mode. So essentially that means that you can now, when using React Router version 7, use it in 2 different ways. As a library to add routing to your React app, as you always did. And again, the way you used it in the past is still the way you use it now, essentially. But you can also use React Router as a framework now, as an alternative to Next.js, for example. By the way, shameless plug, but it really is good to know. I, of course, have my book, React Key Concepts. 2nd edition is out, fully updated for React 19 and also for React Router 7. However, in the book, I cover the library mode, but I do that extensively. I think it's around 80 pages, if I'm not mistaken. Let me quickly take a look. I think it's 80 pages of 500, so almost a fifth of the book is, almost a fifth of the book is all about React Router. So I covered that in depth there. Of course, also in my React the Complete Guide course. If you want, you can buy both or one of them, especially the book is brand new now. Would be amazing, of course, if you do that, if you like the book. But that out of the way. In those resources, I cover the library mode because that, of course, is the mode that's most commonly used. And thank you so much for gifting 5 subscriptions, Alberto Castani. Amazing. Thank you so very much. So yeah, React Router library mode is the mode that's typically getting used. And oh god, we got a hype train started, whatever that means. I'm new to Twitch. I don't know what it is, but I think it's good. But the framework mode is interesting. And to understand this framework mode a bit better, and we'll write some code soon, but to understand it a bit better, it makes sense to take a look at the history of React Router and also Remix. You might know Remix. It's an alternative to Next.js. It's a framework, and V1 was announced, I guess, in November 2021. And the Remix framework is important because it's by the same people as React Router is. It's the same team, you could say, the same 2 main people that also maintained React Router, that developed React Router and so on. Now, over those years, they kind of merged React Router and Remix step by step in small increments, you could say. Like here, by the way, this is the Remix blog, remix.run/blog. In March 2022, we have this blog post, Remixing React Router. Back then, they decided to bring some of the features they built for Remix, for their framework, back into React Router. And what we got back then, sometime later, with version 6.4 essentially in September 2022, was the data fetching capabilities, which you might know. In case you don't, we'll take a look at all these core features soon. Essentially, before version 6.4, you could use React Router for, guess what? Routing, for loading different components for different route paths. After 6.4, or with 6.4, you could also use React Router for data fetching and data mutations, tightly coupled with the routing functionality, so that, for example, when a certain page, a certain component gets loaded, you could use certain React Router features to load some data before that component gets loaded, so that the component, when it's rendered, already has all the loaded data, and you don't need to manually send the HTTP request, use the use effect hook, which we all don't want to use, and so on. So that was great. And you could also use similar features for mutations, so for submitting a form, for example. Again, I did, you probably know that. We'll take a look at all that in the next hours too, and I also cover it in depth in my course and in the book. But they did not stop there. So they brought features from Remix to React Router. Well, then they continued working on Remix and also on React Router. And we got Remix version 2, but I think back then it's mostly like the file-based routing there changed. But we then also have this blog post from May 2024. That's when they published their intentions to essentially merge the Remix framework and React Router, because they essentially recognized over all that time that the framework they were building, Remix, in the end was, you could say, an enhanced version of React Router, and that React Router would benefit from many features of that framework. It already got the data fetching and mutation features. Well, it would only be, I guess, a relatively small step, in quotes, because it definitely was a lot of work, I guess, but a small step to also enable React Router to handle server-side rendering, and therefore give you the capabilities, or some of the very important capabilities you want if you want to use it as a full-stack framework. So that's what they decided to do. And now here we are. React Router version 7 is just that. It's React Router, the way you know it, but if you want, you can now also build full-stack React applications with it. It includes the tools you need for that, you could say, and that's what we'll explore. Okay, so lots of talking. Let's see. Oh gosh, so many messages. You're all amazing. Hi Max, I'm your student since 2021. Learned a lot from React, React Native, Next.js, everything. That's amazing. In general, whenever I get messages like this, so amazing to see that all that knowledge I try to share is helpful. So yeah, thank you all so very much for joining. Any new courses in the future? Some updates for sure. New courses, maybe. I got lots of plans. Time's the only issue, but I'll try my best. Yeah, 1/3 of React projects using React Router, exactly. So it really is a lot. React Router 7 course, I don't know, but today maybe it's a small mini course. I need that book. Well, if you need that book, React Key Concepts, you can get it on Amazon. So that would be amazing. I hope the book is helpful, of course. Please incorporate all these new features in your Udemy course. I already do cover React Router version 7 in there. The framework mode, probably not very soon. Also, because, true story, my React course on Udemy hits the max lecture limit. I literally can't add more lectures to it. Yeah, so I would have to remove content in order to insert new content. I might do that in the future, but right now it's really a tightly packed, large, exciting course that got everything it needs, I guess. Yeah. So, good. This guy looks familiar. I do, hopefully, for some of you at least, or probably for most of you. Yeah, created courses, doing YouTube, now also Twitch, and YouTube streaming, I guess. So let's see. Is this different than Next.js router? It is, but it's best to just have a look, shall we? So let's dive into the official docs and let's explore it together. I have already worked a lot with React Router version 7, the library, also because, as mentioned, it didn't change that much, but I have barely touched the framework. So that should be fun. Now, first, I'll take a brief look at the library, and then we'll take a look at the framework to see how things differ. Now, if we wanted to get started with a new library project, we could create a new Vite project, a standard React project, nothing special there, and simply install React Router as a library and then set up our routes. By the way, that's one important change. When using React Router version 7, you import all the router-related stuff from React Router. In the past, you used to import from React Router DOM, react-router-DOM. However, with V7, you can still use react-router-DOM. So you can keep all the imports the way you have them. That still works, but now I'm not sure if it's the first time, but for a long time, you can also import that browser stuff directly from just react-router. It's a minor thing, but worth noting. So when using the React Router in library mode, you again have two main different ways of using React Router, I would say. When not using it in framework mode, you have two main ways. And you can see one approach here. That's the component-based approach, you could say. You can import various components from React Router to set up your router. And we can see that here in the routing docs. And we'll also write some code later, but I'll want to focus on the framework part there. So for now, we'll stick to the docs. So you can use React Router by just importing a bunch of components from React Router. Browser router to like set up the general router, and then routes to wrap the individual routes you want to have, the route elements, the different paths you want to support. So we can see that really well here. We got the routes for grouping them, and then we have different route definitions here for different paths and then different elements, different components, you could say, that should be loaded. And that's the way we used React Router also with version 5, if I'm not mistaken. It's been a couple of years, but yeah, I think in version 5, that is how we used it. Or almost how we used it. I think with version 6, we got this element here. Before version 6, it was you pointed at a component. Now you instead use a rendered JSX code snippet here, you could say, but it's pretty much the same. So that's how you can define your routes. However, there also is another way of defining your routes in library mode. Let's see if that's also in the docs. Because you can also, where is an example? You can also define your routes in code. And it's fun. That's really interesting. When I explored these React Router docs for the latest version 7, I was really confused to see all this component-based code here again, because when React Router 6.4 was released, which was the last major release, which introduced all these data fetching features, back then, the story essentially was to move away from the component-based route definition to a programmatic definition instead. Here we go. So now I'm in the older docs. I'm in the older docs now, the version 6 docs, 6.28, but that's simply the latest, or almost the latest version 6 version, I guess. And here we can see that there we had to import from React Router DOM, and we started importing create browser router, and then we defined routes in, it's always in code, I guess, but not as JSX elements or as React components, but instead by calling this function, passing an array to it, defining routes as objects, and then sure, the JSX code that should get rendered, but using objects and arrays instead of components. So that was essentially the way to go with version 6.4 or higher if you wanted to use the data fetching functionalities. So I was really, you could also still use the old approach of using components back then. By the way, you can also see this here in the docs in some places. But they they also really, introduced this new approach. So I think they even say somewhere that you can still use the old approach if you wrap the component structure with create routes from elements, but it felt like this would actually be the recommended way, using this non-component based definition approach, I guess. Anyways, that was version 6.4. Now with version 7, this again seems to be the recommended way, though, if I'm not mistaken, this is only an option if you don't want to use these data fetching functionalities. So you can define your routes like this. If you just want routing, you don't care about data fetching, if you essentially want none of the stuff that was introduced with version 6.4. If you do want to fetch data, let's see. The docs are, unfortunately, in my opinion, a bit hard to navigate and use, because they also don't have a lot of docs about the library. But if you want to fetch data, my understanding is that you still need the same approach you used after version 6.4. And I'm skipping over this here a bit because I have separate videos on the Academic YouTube channel. I cover it in my course, so I don't want to bore you with the library. I just want to briefly touch on the history here before we dive into the framework. So essentially different modes. One mode is just define the routes if you only care about that. Second mode is what we had with version 6.4 for data fetching and so on. And then we have the framework mode if you don't want to use React Router as a library. My course is using the programmatic way, correct. As I said, because with version 6.4 introduced, the story, in my opinion, really was to use that programmatic way. And there's nothing wrong with that. So that's why my course also uses that. You can, of course, use whichever approach you want. It says data loading. Yeah, it says data loading here for the framework approach. So the problem I have with the new docs here is that they really have a lot of docs on the framework mode, which makes sense because that's the big thing with version 7. But if you're using React Router in the library mode, which I would guess is the mode most projects use it in, you only have a few dedicated articles here. And then you have some articles where it's not immediately clear if it's referring to the library or the framework mode, and if it's the library mode, if it's the mode where you define routes as route components with the browser router wrapping component, or if you're defining routes in code with the create browser router function. So lots of different approaches here. So yeah, there's that. Now, let's go back to the framework mode though, because that's the big new mode. Because again, you can't just keep on using React Router the way you did if you don't care about the framework mode. So you don't need to be confused by the docs here. You can continue using it as you always did, essentially. You can also take a look at the upgrading from V6 documentation, and you'll see that there are only a few changes that are unlikely to affect you. So that's what I mean. The code should continue to work. But let's now create a new project in framework mode to see how that looks like, because that is quite different in many ways. And then again, it's not, but you'll see what I mean. So I'll copy that command here. We'll use create-react-router at latest to create a new React Router framework-based project. Let me bring up my terminal real quick here on this screen. Okay, whoops. And then here, I'll quickly navigate into my folder and then run this command. And I'll not name it my React Router app. I'll name it RR7 for React Router 7. It seems I'm not the only one who suffer from React Router docs. Yeah, React Router is really amazing, but the docs are not so much, I'd say. I mean, if you know how React Router works, you get by. But if you don't, I'm not sure. Maybe they're great as a beginner because they don't show you advanced stuff you might be looking for immediately, but I don't know. So, created the project. Now I'll open it in VS Code. Yep. Streaming profile is on. Here we go. So, got a brand new React Router app here. And before we explore that, I see there are some more questions. And by the way, sorry if something's slipping through. I'll try to find the right balance between answering and showing you what I want to show you. Hi Max, I just really want to thank you for your courses. They really built a good foundation for me way back in 2010s. I'm eternally grateful, and I'm eternally grateful truly for you and everyone else who took my courses. No matter if it's like 8 years ago or today, I'm super happy that I'm able to create these courses, make a living off that, and hopefully help many people. So yeah, thank you so much for being part. And especially, of course, if you've been part for like 8 years ago already or something like that, it's always fun to like see people that have been part of my courses way back then. I still prefer the way you showed us. I guess you mean with create browser router. Yeah, I also prefer that way. Thanks to you, I jumped on my first ever project at work and learned React from scratch. Recently, I bought my first Udemy course, yours, and started learning Next.js. I'm super excited. Yeah, I hope you'll get a lot out of this course. Next.js is an amazing framework. I hope the course gets you up and running with that framework in no time. And yeah, all the best for that. I got your other courses like Angular, very nice courses. Thanks. Hey, Ryan, thank you so much. Happy to hear you're liking them. I hope you're getting a lot out of them. Might get slammed here, but a route is not the same as an API endpoint, right? Is a route then just a way to load page content? Well, I guess these are, there probably are technically super correct definitions out there, which I don't necessarily know either. I would say you would typically not say route when you mean an API endpoint, I guess. Because an API endpoint to me, and I would guess to many people, is at the end, well, a route, you could say it's a URL, it's a path on a certain domain to which requests that have a certain format or that carry data in a certain format can be sent to trigger something or get back some data or whatever. So that's an API endpoint for me. It's like a way for opening up communication to various clients or to some client. Clients can send requests in a certain predefined way, and they get back certain responses that are also predefined, kind of, so that have a certain shape and so on. And routes, I guess you would typically use that term, not technically, but here in the world of web development, front-end web development, I guess you would say route if you really like mean also a path, a path for a website, so a path of a domain in the end, that should load a certain page, I guess. Yeah, so technically kind of the same, and I guess very technically a route is really just a way for defining an entry point to a server or to an application. But yeah, so I would say route is really if you want to load something, some page or so, and then an API endpoint is like for exchanging data and so on. But you could definitely find better, technically more correct definitions. I'm sure I could be corrected here. Yeah. Could you show your extensions on VS Code? Oh yeah, of course. But actually, nothing too fancy, I guess. Just a bunch of framework extensions for Angular, Astro, Dart, Docker, Flutter, GitHub Actions, GitHub Copilot. I'm using that. Various themes for all the languages I'm working with, essentially. Tailwind, Python stuff. Playwright for testing and for running tests in VS Code. REST client is an interesting one for testing REST endpoints from directly inside VS Code. And yeah, so nothing too fancy, I guess, but a couple of extensions. First time watching your stream, just wanted to say, love your discussions and insights on current trends. Have a nice stream. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being part of the stream. If not for you, I won't be a software engineer. You have changed my life in more ways than I can mention. For the past some years, I've been taking your courses. You have changed my life. Well, thank you so much. Don't know what to say. That's just amazing. I'm honestly super happy to hear that all the content I create is that helpful. And yeah, thank you so much. Okay, got more questions, but the window blinds are coming up, I guess. So yeah, there's that. Let's dive back into this application, shall we? So it's a React application, of course. If we take a look at the package.json file, we'll see that in there we find React, React DOM, version 19. We find React Router, version 7. And it also, I think, creates a TypeScript application by default. So we have these types here. And I guess you could also create a JavaScript application in some way, I guess. Or you could always create a Vite project with JavaScript and manually add all the routing stuff here. Now, what's important to understand, as far as I know, as I understand it, the React Router framework heavily relies on Vite. This here is a Vite project, which is why Vite is installed, why we have a Vite config. And the React Router framework is essentially, if I understand it correctly, a Vite plugin. So a Vite plugin is unlocking all the magic performed by React Router that turns this into a full stack application, into a server-side rendered application, so to say. Now, we can also see that there is a React Router config.ts file, which is probably picked up by that Vite plugin, where you can control the behavior of React Router. For example, if server-side rendering should be enabled, which it by default is. So this will, as you might guess, ensure that all the pages, all the components that are loaded for the different routes are pre-rendered on the fly before they're served to the browser on the server, which also means that, of course, if you want to host such a React Router framework-based app, if server-side rendering is true, then you need a server, a host that is able to run Node.js or some other JavaScript runtime. You can also disable this, of course, to get a single-page application, and I think you can also, you can pre-render. So you can also enable pre-rendering, and I guess either set this to true to have it detect all statically available routes and pre-render them so that you can build a static site with React Router as a framework. So as a replacement for Gatsby, if anyone's still using that, or as an alternative to Next.js export mode and so on. And a couple of other settings, I guess, for configuring this. And then we got a public folder, which essentially contains files that can always be reached by your domain / file name. And then, very important, the app folder. And that's the interesting one, because it's in this app folder where you now define your routes, your components, and essentially all your other app-related code. And here we got this routes.ts file, which is pretty important. Now, remember, when using React Router as a library, you set up your routes in your React components. So in your, or in here in your index.js file, for example, you set up your React Router code. You could also do it in the app component, right? You define your routes there. And even if you're using create browser router, as you did with version 6.4, you do that as part of your React components in the end. You register your routes in your React components. Now, with the framework mode, that changes. Now we have that routes.ts file, and in that routes.ts file, we're exporting an array as a default, and that array must satisfy this route type definition, which in the end means it is an array full of route definitions. That's what this route config type wants to enforce. And there are different ways of defining routes. For example, here we see that a route is defined with the index function here. And it's not obvious, I guess, that this is defining a route. Well, unless, of course, that the file is named routes.ts. So you might guess that it defines a route. But all the index function here, of course, does is it takes a path to a file, to this home tsx file. Now in that file here, we have a component function being exported, a very simple one, which then just returns another component. And we get this meta function, which is also exported. So we got two exported things. One of them is a component. That's the default export, which is important. And then that is in the end what this index function points to. Now the index function is simply one way of defining a route in React Router when using this framework mode. It defines a so-called index route, which simply is like the main route that is loaded if you visit the root path here in this case. So if I just visit mydomain.com/nothing, then the index route is loaded. So the component that's exported as a default by that file is rendered. So we should be able to see that if we run npm run dev to start the development server. And if I now go to localhost 5173, then I see this page here. And the content I see here, that is the content of this welcome component. So in there, I got a bunch of markup, got a bunch of Tailwind classes. Not too important here. It's a regular React component in the end. And that's the component that's rendered by this home component. So that part is not too different from the library mode. We got components that can use other components. The route registration is different. If I recall correctly, there is also some way of configuring this to use file-based routing instead, if you prefer that. You can actually have a look. File-based. Yeah. You can also use file-based routing if you prefer. So you can install an extra package, and then in your routes.ts file, where I export this array, you would export the result of calling flat routes from that extra installed package. And that would allow you to define your routes as files in the routes folder, if you prefer that. I personally don't. I prefer defining routes in code, but if you prefer file-based routing, that is also supported through that extra package here in React Router. But that's how we can define a first route. Now, how can we define a second route? For that, we can't use index again because there is only one index route for a given page would be wrong, or for a given website is wrong, but for a given tree of routes, you could say. So if I want a second route for a different path, not for the root path, because that is what index is for, I can use the route function. That's another function exported by this sub package of React Router. Route also registers a route, but unlike index, it's not always for /nothing for the root page. Instead, it is for any path of your choice, because route now takes at least two arguments. The first argument is the path to the route you want to register. So for example, if I want to have an about you page or an about page, the path could be about. So that would be yourdomain.com/about. And then the second argument is the path to the file in the file system here in the app folder that holds the component that should be loaded, just as it's the case here for index. So that could be routes about tsx. So now we would look for an about tsx file in the routes folder to load it for this about page. So of course I need to add that here. Export it as a default. About. Whoops. Like this. And as a result, if I save everything, hopefully, unsurprisingly, if I visit my domain/about, it's maybe a bit hard to see, but I am on that about page here. So that's how we can register routes here. And that's, again, yet another way than how we do it with the library. I'm not sure, to be honest, if this approach is also available in library mode somehow. I would guess it's not, but I can't rule it out with certainty. My understanding is that this is how we register routes in framework mode, and in library mode we use the component-based approach or the code-based approach I showed you earlier with create browser router. Yeah, there's that. By the way, I think I'm not React resources. Let me see. I'm not a big fan of just talking about how that other approach looks like. Just to briefly show you, this is the course, the code from my React course. It's on GitHub. And there in routing, you can see that this is also how you can define routes with React Router. And that is also for version 7. So, okay, here I actually have still version 6 logged in, but the same code would work with version 7. You can call create browser router, which is from React Router DOM, which still works with version 7 as mentioned. And then here you can define for which path, which element should be rendered. So that's the non-component based, non-framework mode for registering routes. But that's the framework mode. Now let's dive a bit deeper, but first, questions. Oh gosh, so many questions. With a router, you compose interfaces. That would be a good explanation. You are returning nested layouts, so you're composing. Well, I guess I also compose interfaces without a router. Also with just React, I compose interfaces in the end. But sure, yeah, a router helps with that. It allows you to load different interfaces for different paths of your page, I could say. Can you say anything? This AI thing, everyone is crying that it will replace engineers. I have said a lot about that in past streams and also in separate videos on my YouTube channel. I don't want to bore everyone by going on a rant for another 10 minutes here. Short story is AI is here to stay. You should use AI. You should not rely on just AI. Otherwise, you will get dumber and lose skill or not evolve your skills, which is bad. I don't see a future anytime soon where AI will replace developers, but it will definitely replace developers or developers who use AI and continue enhancing their skills will replace developers that use AI without thinking or developers that don't use AI at all, probably. That's the short summary of my take. V7 does not need much documentation because most of the features in V6 still work. That is true, but on the other hand, of course, if you're just learning React Router and the V7 documentation doesn't contain all the things you can do, that's too bad because you might not know version 6. Love your stream. One question, is it complicated to deploy Next.js app? My friend told me it can be challenging. It's super easy if you're using Vercel or Netlify, I guess. If you're self-hosting, it can be a bit trickier. Also not super tricky, but it can be a bit trickier if you then want to ensure that, for example, if you're pushing a new version and that replaces your old version and people are currently using your page, they might have cached old assets or links to old assets that no longer exist. So this part, the part where you update your deployed version, that can be tricky if you're self-hosting. At least that's my understanding. However, that knowledge is already 1 or 2 years old. Might have gotten better. It's definitely not difficult if you use Vercel or Netlify. What does the satisfies keyword do? That's indeed interesting. I will include it in my TypeScript course in the future because it's relatively new, not super new, but a relatively new TypeScript feature. In the end, satisfies is very useful for situations like this, where the developers of the React Router team want to give us a type definition that we can use to make sure that we define routes correctly. That we, for example, that we don't add a string in here, which would not be correct. Now, you could, of course, say, well, that can also be done by using this we could also have something like this, right? We could also define routes like this, and this would also enforce that we define routes in a certain correct way. The difference is that when you use satisfies, Typescript will actually narrow down the actual type it infers from this code here to your actual route definition in this case. We can see this a little bit later, that this will actually ensure that we get TypeScript support in places where we might otherwise not get it. So satisfies ensures that a certain type is used correctly, that we adhere to a certain type definition, whilst at the same time allowing very narrow type inference. And actually we can see this here in the home route already. See this import here? This type import of the route type from this weird path? It imports from a folder named plus types, which seems to be a sibling folder of home TSX, but there is no such folder here. Well, that's in the end some behind the scenes magic performed by the Vite plugin provided by the React Router team. They are generating types on the fly based on your route definition, for example, to give you access to those types in your code again, because they're generated on the fly, to give you better type support. And we can see that a little bit later once we add data fetching, because we will be able to get great data fetching type support in our components. So that's the idea here. But will become a bit clearer once we start using that data fetching. Yeah. Good. So why don't we fetch some data then? Let's say we will build the we'll just fetch a bunch of to-dos, blog posts. I know it's not super exciting, but I don't want to spend an hour setting up a database for an online shop. I want to dive into React Router. So let's add a posts TSX file here. Let's add a new route. Posts, routes, posts TSX. Okay, so now we have that route. And in here, I now want to fetch some fictional, some made up blog posts. So let's say we have a blog posts database, but for the moment we just have an array here. We can add a database later. For now, we'll have an array where every post has an ID, P1, a title, first post, and a description. And then let's say we have 2 posts. So just so that we have some data to work with. And obviously, this is some hard-coded data in some variable or constant here. We would absolutely not need any data fetching or HTTP request sending capabilities here. Let's just imagine this is coming from a database and we therefore don't want to have to code in our client-side code because we don't want to reach out to the database from the client side because A, it may not be accessible from there, and B, even if it is, we don't want to share our credentials on the client side. So let's imagine this is coming from a source that should only be accessed on the server side. How can we do that in React Router? Well, with version 6.4 already, one second. Let's say here we have blog posts. So with version 6.4 already, what you could do is you could export a function named loader, though in version 6.4 it actually did not have to be named a loader. In version 6.4 you could export a function of any name and then in your route definition register that as a loader. Again, let me go back to that code from the course. In there, we can see that we have, where is the data fetching loader? Here we can see that we have a page, an events page. Where am I fetching data? Okay, here we can see that in the create browser router, I'm registering a function, in this case an anonymous function, as a loader for this index route of my events route tree. So as a child route of the events route, here I have a loader. And that was already possible with React Router version 6.4. However, back then it was not a framework. So this code here in the loader actually ran on the client side. That's super important. This code was executed on the client side, which is why here I'm sending a request to a separate backend. Now with React Router version 7 in framework mode, we can register code that runs on the server side, just as you could in Remix. Remember, that's that framework by the React Router team. There, they also had this loader concept. I mean, they brought it from Remix to React Router after all. And in Remix, it always was on the server side. Now, when using React Router in framework mode, this also is on the server side. If you want a client-side loader, you can export a function called client loader. And now the naming is also important because the React Router framework will look for functions with these specific names. So you can't name this my loader, for example. It must be named loader because previously you explicitly had to register that for the loader key in your route definition when using React Router in library mode. In framework mode, you don't do that. There, you register your routes like this, and in that route definition, you don't explicitly tell React Router which function should be used as a loader and so on. Now, you can configure these routes here with extra objects, or with one extra object, I guess, but even there, I can't define a loader. Now, I'm not sure if the route function here also gives me some way of defining a loader or of changing the name it looks for, but by default it's looking for a function named loader. And then the code in that function will be executed on the server side, even though I also have a component in that same file, and that component code will also be executed on the client side. Not just, it will also be pre-rendered on the fly on the server side, but if I were using state in there, it would update on the client side. But even though I have that in that file too, any code in the loader will only run on the server side. Code in the client loader will also run on the client side. So here I can now return my blog posts. And again, kind of stupid redundant code here. Let's assume we indeed fetch that from a database here. So we might have our code for loading posts from a database here. Now I'm returning that. And now how do I get that data here in that function? When using React Router in library mode, you need to use a specific function. You need to use the useLoaderData function in the component that wants to get access to the data fetched by the loader. That's how you do it in React Router library mode. In the framework mode here, you don't need that. Instead, your component will get the loader data, the data fetched through the loader, in its props. And that's now where this dynamic automatic type inference, this ongoing type generation comes in handy. Because I can import a route here now, and I'll import the routes for my posts route here. You see that here? For the post, I'm not in the way of it. Good. So I'll import this route from types posts. Again, that's one of these dynamically generated type definitions. And this route type here in the end, this route namespace, has various actual types. So that's a namespace, but then in there are multiple types that have been generated. And for example, there is a component props type. And that's the props type for this specific route component that has been dynamically generated. And in there, I find my loader data, for example. I also find information about the route params if I have any, or any action data. We'll get to this later, but I also find the loader data. So that loader data, that's the interesting part now. If I hover over that, that indeed has the shape of my blog posts. So it knows that this will be an array of objects where every object has an ID, a title, and a description. So that is inferred from this array, from the shape of the data returned here. So that's why this dynamic type generation is pretty amazing. Good. And now, of course, I can use that here and output an unordered list, let's say, and map all these entries to list items, and that will look super ugly, but it should work. If I go there, visit /posts, you can see first post, this is the first post, second post, this is the second post, third post, this is the third post. So that's now here. You can also see if I view the page source, that this content, which we can see here, will actually be hard-coded in there. So you can see it here. This is part of the page source code, this blog post data. And that source code is what was fetched from the server. So this proves that this is server-side rendered. And that's why that already worked that way, or almost that way, in Remix. And now it also works that way in just React Router when using that framework mode, which is pretty useful. You can type routes now in React Router. Yes, you can, essentially. And I think they're also working on making sure that you get good TypeScript support if you add links. So if you add a link with the link component, which is provided by React Router, which has always been a thing in React Router, there right now with the version I'm using, I'm getting no completion here. And I think what they're trying to do, and what will ship relatively soon, is that here I get suggestions and I get type checking that I only set up paths that are supported by my route config. Now, to be honest, I never found it such a big problem to accidentally write a wrong path, because you typically catch those errors when testing. But still, it's a nice thing to get all this good TypeScript support. I'm working with React, Vue, and Express and all of that in JavaScript, so I want to learn a new language, but I'm confused between Go and C#. What do you think, which have better future? I think both languages are great. Go is, I think, not too hard to learn if you have a JavaScript background, but C# is also not super difficult, in my opinion. C#, of course, has the advantage that it's, for example, also quite popular for game development. So if you ever consider moving out of web development, that might be interesting. But yeah, you can't go wrong with either language, I would say. What is the tool you're using to create arrows and squares? That is the, what's the name? Demo Pro. Demo Pro is the name of this tool. I think it's a Mac-only tool, though. Hi Max, thank you for the courses. I have 6 or 7 of them. Do you think that the React team will ever make the context more usable, or we will have to rely on Redux, React Query, or Zustand for state management? So I think React context is relatively usable, but I guess I think what you mean, it's a lot of boilerplate to set it up. Lots of boilerplate you always have to repeat, and then you might end up with deep nesting and various problems. So I don't think that is a big topic or a big priority for the React team. It seems like their biggest priority is to continue fine-tuning and polishing all the server actions, server component stuff, the suspense stuff. I would hope they make that a bit more usable in non-Next.js apps, for example, but I don't think that state management is high up on their priority list. I don't understand the plus type. Why is that? So that plus type folder here and the types exposed through there is not actually a folder that exists here. Instead, that is dynamically generated by the Vite plugin, by the React Router Vite plugin, and then therefore then made available that way in your code files. And it gives you simply access to types, TypeScript types that are generated dynamically based on your route definition, based on your loader, on your component shape, so based on your code, so that you get great type support based on, for example, which data is being fetched by your loader. What are the perks of using React Router over React Router DOM? Will you show some insight, please? Absolutely no perks. You can use, if you in library mode, you can use React router by importing from React router DOM as you always have, or you can switch to just React router when using version 7. I think at some point in the future, it will probably only be react-router, but for all the years it has been this syntax, and in older versions you need to use this package for importing. So that's why you will probably see that in most projects. But there is no advantage of switching. Okay, so that's how we can fetch data. Now, let's say we also want to change data. And for that, I'll add yet another route, new post. And I'll not worry about styling here so that we can focus on the framework. So here I'll add a new post component and I'll register that, of course. So I'll add a posts/new route, which points at that new post TSX file. By the way, if you have multiple routes that start with the same common path, you can use the prefix function to define that common prefix, then an array, and then move your routes that share that path into that array, and then remove the prefix from there. At least that is my understanding. What's the problem here? Let's take a look at the docs. I know that there is some prefix functionality. So let's see. Route prefixes. I need to spread the result, I guess. Okay. So now in theory, hopefully, if I go to new post and I also return something there temporarily, if I can type new post, now in theory, I should still be able to visit /posts or /posts new. Yep, that works. But now I'm reusing or I'm sharing that prefix. And for 2 routes, that's not too important. But of course, if you have like 10 routes that all start with the same path, this can be useful. It's also worth noting that prefix does not generate like a shared layout or a nested route. It's really just there to save you the hassle of repeating that prefix. And of course, you can now also easily change it. If you, for some reason, wanted that path in all these paths, you could easily do that. So there's that. There also are layouts and there are nested routes, but I'll get to them later. So now we have the new post route. In there, of course, I don't want to have that title, or not just that title at least. Instead, I want to have a form. And of course, traditionally in React, you would create a form, and then you would create your handle submit function, and in there get some event of type form event in this case when using TypeScript, and then you would call event prevent default, connect that to the onSubmit prop here, and then you would start collecting the entered values. Now, of course, when using React 19, which we do in this project, we're using React 19. When doing that, you could also use a form action. So you could have your submit action. The name, by the way, is not important. But in there, you would get form data. And you would not need to prevent any default. And you could simply trigger it like this. That's supported by React 19. By the way, I also cover this in my course and in my book. It's all updated for React 19. I cover form actions in great depth there. Got a separate section in my book, and it got a separate chapter, and a separate section in my course. However, when using React Router, you don't need that. Instead, you can use the form component provided by React Router, starting with a capital F, and then you can export an action function here. So we got loader for loading, and we got action for changing, you could say. And of course, now I'll add a little store, my database TS file, which does not really contain a database, but I'll outsource my blog posts into that store here. And then I'll export a function get posts where I will simply return blog posts. And I will add a new function add post where I expect to get an object which has a title and a description. And I will extract that here. And then in there, I will push that into my blog posts and generate an ID like this. So now back in posts, instead of returning blog posts like this, I return the result of calling get posts. So I'm importing that get posts function from that store DB file I just worked on. And in new post, I now want to call this add post function to tweak this array. Again, simulating that we have a database. We don't really have one here, but we can simulate it. So now here in my action, I need to get access to the, or let's start differently. I got my action here. How do we trigger that? Well, with help of that form, because this form component provided by React Router works such, also, by the way, in library mode, that it triggers the closest action that belongs to the currently active route. And you can register actions in library mode too. Just to have a brief look at it. Let's go to, where's the routing chapter? Here. In there, I certainly have my, oh, that's the wrong folder. In the routing chapter, I got my actions. Here they are. Edit event. They are registered here. Where is it? Loader. Action. New event action. So I got an action exported here too. In library mode, I had to explicitly register it, but then there too, this action would be triggered by this form. Now for the form to trigger an action in the way I want it, I need to set the method to post. And with that, behind the scenes, React Router will make sure that a post request is sent without reloading the page. So not in the way it would happen in a normal form. There you can also trigger a post request, but that would then load to, it will lead to a brand new page or to your page being reloaded. Here the request will be sent behind the scenes from within the currently loaded page without reloading it essentially. You're still staying in the single page application experience. But it will trigger the closest action. And then here in that framework mode, unlike the library mode, this action will run on the server, just like the loader. So here we could safely reach out to a database. Now in this action, I now need access to the submitted data. And for that, I first of all need some data to be submitted. So I'll quickly add a label, title, and then I input here type text with a name of text. And the name, by the way, is important. We'll need that name to be able to extract the data because only inputs with a name will be included in the submitted data, and you'll be able to extract that, that submitted value with help of that name. And the name here should be title, by the way. And then I'll have a second label for my description input. And then there too, let's keep it simple. Have an input of type text with name description. And then I'll add a button, which will submit this all. So very simple, definitely ugly form, which will trigger this action. Now in the action, I need to get access to the data that is being collected and submitted here. And again, it will be collected and submitted automatically because I'm using this form component. Now, how do I get access to that submitted data? Well, the action does not get the data as an input, but it will get an argument of type route. Let me pick the proper route type here for new post. So that's what I'll import here. Route, and then there is an action args type. And that then gives me these types. Now here actually the type isn't too specific. There is nothing too specific about this route. If I had a route with a dynamic path parameter, however, we would see a difference, but we'll see that later. So for now, I'm interested in that request object. That is an object of type request. So the standard request class in the end, or interface that's built into the browser and also into Node.js. And then here we can access the body. We can also access utility functions like JSON if we were to get data in JSON format, or in this case here, form data, because this automatic submission here will happen in the form data format. So here we can call form data to extract the submitted data from the incoming request. Now this actually returns a promise, and in order to await it, I'll add async here. Your actions, like your loaders, can be async. They don't have to be, but they can be. They can return promises. And then here I'll get my form data. And from that form data, I can then get the title and the description. Now I'll cast both to strings to make Typescript happy in the next steps. And then here, of course, we could add validation, use sort, or add validation manually. But here I'll just assume that we got valid values, and then I want to reach out to my database, or in this case, call add post from the dbts file. So I'll call add post, import that, and to add post, add an object, which includes my title and description. And that's that. Now we might want to add error handling. Here, there is nothing that could fail realistically. So we can do what? Well, if we're on a new page for creating a new post, we might want to redirect and go to a different page once we're done. And React Router helps you with that too. Again, also available in the library mode, but also available here in the framework mode where this runs on the server. We can return the result of calling redirect, and redirect is a function imported from React Router. Redirect returns a response in the end, and by the way, you could also construct a response manually here, including a redirect response. Redirect is simply a little convenience function that simplifies that process. It allows you to specify a path of the page you want to redirect to. So for example, we're done creating a new post. Now I want to redirect to the posts route. And on that posts route, guess what? The loader will get called and will load the posts, including our newly added post. So we will have up-to-date pages without manually writing any fetch code or using any use effect anywhere in our components. So if I save everything, again, this is of course not pretty and the inputs are hard to see, but if I enter something here and I click submit, you see I'm redirected and my newly added post is here. And that all happened thanks to actions and loaders. Again, it already worked that way before version 7 in library mode. I do cover that in my course, in my book, but this now is new because this code now actually runs on the server, thanks to this framework mode. And therefore, as you can see, if you've played around with Next.js, we're doing things here which you could do kind of the same way using server components and server actions in Next.js. So the approach is a different one with loaders and actions, and it's up to you to judge which approach you prefer, but you can do the same thing. You can build a full stack application with mutations and data fetching and so on. Okay, so again, lots of talking. I hope it was clear what I meant. So yeah, thank you all so much for the amazing feedback. Seeing so many nice messages here. Honestly, it's just amazing always to read that. So thank you so much. Hi Max, big fan. Are you considering, I guess, making a definitive 10-stack start course? 10-stack start is another framework that's coming up to compete with Next.js and Remix, or now React Router, I guess. I have not explored it yet. Not sure if I'll create a course on it, but a stream, some YouTube videos, why not? Definitely interesting. It looks to be having good usage with React Query for server-side rendering. What do you think, Max? Useful for real-world projects? React Query is definitely useful for real-world projects. You might not need it as much when using, for example, React Router or Remix here when loading your data as I just showed it to you. Though you still can use it there too. You can also define API routes with React Router, which are routes that just have a loader but no component connected to it. And you could then fetch data from there, from within another component, for example. And you could do that with React Query. So you could do that if you had a use case for this. But in many routes, you might not need it. But in general, since, of course, many React projects are a decoupled frontend that needs to communicate with a decoupled backend, React Query vastly simplifies this and is an amazing library. Okay, so many messages. I'm sorry if I'm skipping messages. Just don't. I want to find the right balance between answering and continuing, of course. Not related to this, but I'm just starting to learn Next.js. Should I start with version 15? I want to learn it and look for a job related to it. Yeah, I would definitely start with the latest version. Absolutely. I've taken all your courses. It's amazing. Thank you so much. It really means a lot to me. I hope you got a lot out of them. I hope they were useful. And it's so amazing to see so many people that took the courses, liked the courses. It really means a lot to me. Not a fan of server actions. Dynamic request URL with post is weird for me, and not having Swagger endpoint is a deal breaker for me. Yep, you of course don't have to use any of that. The good thing is there are so many ways of building that. There should be a way for everyone, I guess. Okay. I got a question regarding caching here in Next.js. Yeah, caching can be a pain in Next.js, especially because there are differences between development and production mode, which is why I always test my production build before deploying it, because some weird things can change due to caching being more aggressive in production mode. But I do actually have a pretty deep dive into caching in my Next.js course. If you're taking that section should be helpful. AWS, SysOps, and DevOps courses. I actually have the certificates. AWS courses are a lot of work, and to be honest, are not that successful for me. So since I, of course, also have limited time, I don't have any concrete plans for more AWS, for these AWS courses right now. Maybe also no AWS courses in general. I don't know yet. But yeah, I would love to do more on that. It's just gotta balance my time. How can I send some gift for you? That's, I don't know what to say. That's just amazing. But you don't need to send me any gifts. If you want to gift me something, really, like participating here, you don't need to send me money or anything like that. Just like having a good time, participating here, being friendly to others. That's the most amazing thing. And if you do want to support me, obviously you can buy courses, you can buy my book. That's a great way of supporting me. But no need for gifts. I already feel blessed by all the nice messages, all the amazing people. So yeah, thank you all so much. Good. So we saw some features here already, some features which we already know from React Router in general, but which now also are available in that framework mode. Now, another interesting feature, I guess, another interesting feature is the layout feature. So what we can do in our route definition is we can also define layouts with help of the layout function, which is also imported from the same place where prefix and route and index were imported. And the idea behind layout really is that you can have a shared layout for multiple routes. So the way this works is that you have an array with your route definitions that should share this layout as a second argument. And the first argument is a file that points to a component that defines your shared layout. So a layout is a component that is wrapped around other routes without adding any extra path. Prefix is also wrapped around other routes but adds no component. Layout is wrapped around other routes and adds a wrapping component. That's the difference. So we could add a new route, or also, I guess, in a separate folder, in a components folder, let's say, we could have our posts layout TSX file and export a function here, posts layout. And in there, we could return a shared layout where we, for example, have a header where we say blog posts and where we have like a little navigation with 2 links, where the first link leads to all posts and the second link leads to new posts. And then here, do I have Tailwind here, by the way? I don't know. Yeah, we do have Tailwind by default, great. So here, just for some styling, we could add a flex here. And now if I wanted to use that here as a layout so that I have the shared navigation for all my post-related pages, I need to add an outlet here. This outlet component, which is imported from React Router. And that's the placeholder where the actual route components will be loaded. So the actual page components. So the posts and new post component. And now in the routes definition, I need to point at that posts layout TSX file here. So now that file will be used as a layout. And as a result, let me highlight that so that it's a bit easier to see. So as a result, we now got this header here. And there I can click on posts to see all posts, or new posts to go to this new post page. By the way, I will also wrap a little main section around here to add some shared padding here to all these post-related routes. And then I guess on posts to also help a little bit with styling there at least. I'll add a margin to the bottom here. BG gray. Whoops. 900. P4 rounded. And let's add a border just to make them a bit easier to see here. I know this is not good looking. This is just to make things a bit easier to see. That's the entire point here. Let's remove the title. So we got that. And now on new post, because I could spend a significant amount of time on styling this, I'm just not sure if that would be very interesting, which is why I rather don't do it here. And of course, you could also use something like Shadcn or stuff like that. I am aware of that. So let's add this here. Class name. Give it a max width of, let's say, 30 rem. And then repeat that also here. Yeah, it's a little bit better, not good, just a little bit better. So font bold, text LG. Here we go. And the button, let's also style the button. Let's add some random color all of a sudden. Okay. Awesome. Definitely the best styling I have ever seen. But now we can see the difference a bit better between these different pages and what's going on. So now we added a layout here. Here. One other thing we can add, also in React Router, is a dynamic route with a dynamic path parameter. So let's say we want to be able to view the details of a given post, even though in this demo app there aren't too many details because every post here has just a title and a description. But let's say we had more content, and therefore we want to show the title and description on the overview page here where we show all posts, but we also want to have a route for the details. Well, for that we can add a new route, which still starts with posts. Don't forget that. So it's posts / something, and the something here should be a placeholder. Excuse me. So it should be a placeholder here. So that means we want to have /posts / some ID, and we don't know the ID yet because of course posts are also generated when the application is running. So we just have a placeholder for the actual ID. And then here we have a path to post details tsx, let's say. So we got post -details tsx, export default function post details, and add the route import for post details. And in there, of course, I also want a loader because I want to load the data for one specific post now, the post with the ID that is actually inserted into the path. So I want to have a loader here, which again will execute on the server because we're still in the framework here. And then here I want to output the post details. So I want to output the post title, but of course the actual title, and I want to output the post description. And I need to get both from the loader. So first of all, I'll go to my dbts file, and in there I'll add a new function, getPost, where I expect to get an ID, which is a string, and then I want to return that one post that has that ID. Of course, in theory, we could also look for a post that does not exist, so where we don't find the ID. So what we can of course do is get our post here, and if we don't have a post, we throw an error, otherwise we return it. In post details in the loader, I now want to call getPost. But I now need to know which ID. How do I get that? Well, the loader receives that data. On that route namespace, there is a loader args type, which defines the type, or the type for this argument object. We can see that, like in the action, we got a request, for example, but we also got params. And that's now, again, the nice thing where we get some nice type inference going on, because this params object is now not of type any, as it is in many other frameworks and libraries. Instead, params here is an object where we have an ID property. And why is it ID? Well, because I chose ID in my route definition here. If I would have chosen post ID here and saved this to have the types be regenerated, it would be post ID here. So that's really nice. That's now one of the places where I really like this type inference, because now I can get my post ID by accessing params post ID. Or of course by using destructuring. Like this. And then I can pass this to getPost. Now post ID is a string, because everything in your path, every concrete value in your route path will always be a string, because your overall path in the URL is text, it's a string. And this will then give us a post. Now, of course, this may also fail. We may get an error, and we might want to handle that. But first, let's start with the success case. And in that case, we can, of course, return that one post. And then again, here in post details, we get the loader data. And that loader data, of course, also has good type inference now. We can see that loader data will have... Oh, I spoke too early. Not sure why I'm not getting auto-completion, because of course we can see here that types are inferred correctly. That we have an ID, title, description, because I am returning a post here. I guess I don't get that here, because loader data could be undefined, because I'm not returning anything if we have an error. I guess that's the problem here. So I'll check. If not loader data, if that is undefined, then I know something went wrong, and in this case, I can say something, or I can say post not found. because I know that I won't return anything here. I will return null, for example, to have some explicit code if we have no post. If I make it past this if check, loader data will be defined, or it should be defined, I guess. Let's see if it is. And I should be able, yeah, now I can destructure. So now I can get my title and my description, and I can use that down here. So I can output my title, and I can output my description. And again, this is all, this is all pre-rendered on the server, and this code executes only on the server, as mentioned before. So now, in order to be able to go there in my posts, I want to construct a link with the link component, which works the same way you know it from the library mode. Read full post could be the text, and the path needs to be generated dynamically. I also need to add that import from React Router. And the path needs to be generated dynamically because the path is /posts/ the ID, the concrete ID of that post. So I'll insert it here, post ID. And with that, I should be able to go to my posts, have my read the full post link here. It's not obvious that it's a link yet, but we know it is. So if I click this, I get taken to /posts/p1, and I can see my post data here. And of course, that's also not something you haven't seen before in other frameworks, but that is how it works in the React Router framework. Now, one thing we could do here now is I'm just thinking which features I want to cover too. So yeah, what we could do here is we could also work with a nested route. So we could, for example, say that instead of loading the post details on a totally new page, so instead of loading them like this, we might want to load the post details here below a post, which is kind of stupid here. Well, we could say the description is not included here, and we want to load that after clicking that button. So one way of achieving this would be to set up a nested route. And you can set up a nested route by adding a third argument to a route definition and making that an array. With that, you can define routes that are nested to that route. Now, the difference compared to a layout route is that you will have a shared component and a shared path. With a layout route, you have a shared component but no shared path. With prefix, you have a shared path but no shared component. With a nested route, you have a shared component and a shared path. The shared path is /posts in this case. So I could move my detail route, not the new route, but the detail route, into the post route. And now I would load this component, this post details component, into this posts component. For that to work, I need to mark the place where it should be loaded though. And here we could say that by default, we're not showing the description. Instead, I want to load my detail path here. And I mark that place with the outlet component just as I did it in the layout. And now in post details, I'll actually not load the title because I already have the title in the posts component. I don't want to have two titles. I'll just load the description. Again, really made up example here, but you get the point, I guess. You can see the features here. So with that, if I click read full post, you see the data is loaded here and the URL changed. If I go back, it disappears. So it looks like this is popping in as if we were using use state, but that's actually not what's happening. Instead, the path is changing and a different route is loaded, and it's just loaded as a nested route here. That's what's happening. Okay. What do we have? Yeah, thank you also so much again for all the nice messages. Great stream as always. What do you think about combining GraphQL and React.js, Next.js? Is it a good idea? So, if I'm not totally mistaken, GraphQL was kind of invented for React. Was it not invented by Facebook actually in 2018, 19? I don't know. So it can definitely be combined with React really well. With Next.js, there is definitely some way of making it work, I would guess, but I have not seen this combination very often. I have definitely not used it, and I have, in general, not used GraphQL in a long time. I feel like GraphQL was like a big hype at some point back in 2018. I don't know. But then people decided, let's just continue using REST APIs. And now we have this new paradigm in Next.js apps, I should say, where you have this tightly integrated approach with server actions and React server components. React Router framework mode is remix free. Why merge docs? We know remix React Router separately. Yeah, so I guess I also found it confusing that they would have remix and React Router and it's the same, but both exists. I guess the future plan is to not have remix be that framework it is today. Instead, I think they want to transform remix into something else, a collection of best practices or maybe a collection of additional libraries. I don't know with certainty yet. And they just decided, hey, let's merge it all into React Router because there are so many similarities. We can make React Router better if we bring the ideas from Remix to it, but if we do so, there's no reason to keep Remix around. So I guess that was their reasoning. I don't know for certain though, just what I think. Hi, big fan of yours. I've taken your React, Next.js, and Node.js course over on Udemy. It really bumped up my confidence. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Super happy to hear that the courses had this effect. Oh, wow, it's Max, the code oracle from Germany. Great to see you on Twitch. Great to see you. Thanks for joining. Good. So, we covered a couple of interesting features here. Now, React Router has more to offer. And again, these are mostly features that already existed in Remix and that already existed in React Router library before version 7. Then they just always ran on the client side because there was no server-side rendering built in, so to say. Let's see what else is interesting exploring. Yeah, here we can see what I mentioned at the very beginning, that you can configure how your React Router framework app gets rendered. You can disable server-side rendering, and then you would have a single-page application, and you would still build it with that framework mode to take advantage of that route definition file and so on. But in single application mode, your loaders and so on, of course, won't run on the server. I guess we can see that. We should be able to see that if I add a console log here, posts loader. You see, it runs here. The log is shown here in my terminal, and that is where I started the server. So everything in here is are logs from the server. In my page here, if I go to the posts page, you will see that in my DevTools, there's nothing there besides this one message. So the text post loader is not showing up here. Now, of course, if I switch and set SSR to false to switch to single page application mode, we should see that if I start this here in the terminal, if I reload, okay, that's interesting. Okay, in that case, I get an error that loader is an invalid export in single page application mode. So I thought that what would happen maybe is that loader will continue to work, but now on the client side, basically as it does if you're using React Router in library mode. Because if you're using React Router in library mode, for example, as I showed in my course, also with version 7, you do define loader functions. They're not called client loader. They're called loader there too. They can be called loader, and they will run on the client because that's all the library does by default. It does not manage any server-side rendering for you. Now, when using the framework, as it turns out, if you do want to build a single-page application, You can do so, but you would then have to load data, I guess, through the client loader function, because that runs on the client side. You can also use client loader when server-side rendering is enabled, in case you have something that should be fetched on the client side. But with server-side rendering enabled, you can also use the loader, of course. But it's interesting to know that there is this little difference that loaders really only run on the server. And if you don't give it a server, you'll get an error. That's good to know, I guess. Good. What else do we have? Yeah, here in data loading, we can learn a bit more about client data loading and server data loading. Again, really important to understand, loader will only run on the server when using this framework mode. You can also, if you enable pre-rendering, which is also something you can enable by setting that pre-render setting in the router config, I should say. When doing that, your loaders will be called during the build process. So if you're building a blog statically, for example, you could fetch your blog posts, as I'm doing it in the demo app, in the loader. But instead of enabling server-side rendering, you pre-render your entire app, and it will generate a bunch of pre-rendered static HTML pages that are generated from the loaded data. And for that, the loader will be called during the build process to load the data it needs for building. You can also combine loaders, sure. We covered actions. Yeah, what's interesting about actions is that there you can also return data. Here I'm returning a redirect because after being done, I want to redirect. Now we could, for example, also return data if validation fails though. So let's say we're trying to validate and we check whether we maybe don't have a title, or if we have one and we trim it, it's an empty string. And we do the same for the description. So I'm validating that I got a valid title and description. And if that's not the case, if I got no title or an empty title or an empty description, then I don't want to redirect. I want to keep the user on the page they're on. I maybe just want to show an error message. And for situations like this, but also for any other use case you might have, you can also return data in your loader. Instead of a response, instead of a redirect, as I'm doing it here, you can return data. For example, an object where an error property is set and contains some error message. But it's totally up to you what you want to return. It's your action. So just as in the loader, you can return essentially any data you want, whatever you need for your application. Here it's this object. In the component, you now can get access to this data. Again, through the route props, just as with the loader. So we can use route component props here, and there is an action data field. So React Router will make sure that it re-renders, it re-evaluates your component whenever your loaders are called again or your actions have been called. Unless you redirect, of course, then you load a different path and a different component. But if you return data, then this component function is invoked again and you get updated action data. So here we can check if action data is set, because it might not be set when the component is when the component function is called for the first time. For example, action data will be undefined. Why? Because actions are only triggered when you submit a form, or when you submit anything but a GET request, essentially. So if you send anything but a GET request, then an action is triggered. But for the first page load, there is only this GET request, so there it's not triggered. So that's why action data may be undefined. The action may not have run. But if it is defined and it has an error property, then I know we had an error. And in that case, I don't want to return something else, but I will return an error here, an error element, let's say. So React node. And that will be, let's say, this paragraph with this error message. We can insert this here above the button. So this error variable either contains nothing or it contains this paragraph with the error message, and I'm outputting it here. And with that, if I go back, create a new post, and try to submit this without data, you see I get this error message. And again, that is all controlled by React Router. And please watch this refresh icon. I mentioned it before, but now I reload it deliberately, but please watch it now. I mentioned it before. If I submit here, you will not see this change or spin or anything like that. So the page is not reloading. React Router always sends these requests behind the scenes and updates your UI. So you stay in that single page application experience. But that's now how we can, for example, also return data in an action instead of redirecting. So that's also good to know. For navigating, we got link, navlink. That already exists in the library too. I have used the link component here in various components. It, in the end, gives you an anchor element where React Router just makes sure that, just as with form submissions, no actual page reloading request is sent, but instead it intercepts this action and updates the page for you, updates the DOM for you based on your route configuration. Now, besides that link component, there also is a navlink component, which works in the same way, but it, for example, automatically gets a CSS class called active assigned to it. And it also simplifies the process of changing the style of a link when the route the link points to is active. And I can show this to you here in the posts layout TSX file. If you replace link with navlink and get rid of the link import, it will continue to work as before. But now, for example, class name does not just take a string, but instead it also takes a function. And that function gets an object automatically passed in by React Router. And that object has an isActive property. And this isActive property can then be used to return certain styles for this link that should only be shown if that link is active. So if the path, if the route the link leads to is the currently visible route, the currently loaded route, so to say. So here we could say, in that case, if isActive is true, or let's do it like this. If isActive is true, I want to give this, let's say, this light blue color here. If it's not true, I'll use white instead. And of course, we could also add a hover style, but I'll keep it simple here. Do the same for the other navlink. Also have this function form for class name. And with that, you'll see that if I'm on posts, this is highlighted. On new post, both are highlighted though. And both are highlighted because for new post, the route also starts with /posts, right? And this first link here leads to /posts. So you could say this link is also active for /posts/new. That's why both are highlighted. To change this behavior, you can add the end prop to navlink. This tells React Router that this should only be treated as active if the currently active URL ends with this path, which posts/new does not. So with that, it's now no longer active here. So that's something you can do. We got the form element, we saw that, you can redirect. I will say there are also programmatic ways of submitting a form in case you, for example, wanted to show a confirmation dialog before the request is sent. React Router gives you various hooks, like the use submit hook. You can use that to trigger an action. You can get a submit function from use submit and then call submit to manually construct a request, a post request, which will also trigger the closest action, just as this form element does. The advantage here just is that you can do it programmatically. So if you wanted to show a confirmation dialog and wait for confirmation, you could do so. For example, to show this to you here on new post, I could add my good old handle submit function, bring it back, have my form event here, because now I do want to handle the submission manually. I'll prevent the default. I'll extract the data from the form like this, for example. We could also do it with refs or with state, but here I'll do it with form data. And then I'll use this use submit hook. So use submit from React Router. Here it is. And this will give me a submit function. And now here in handle submit, I can call submit, this function. And I have to provide the data that should be submitted as the first argument, and then some configuration telling it which action to trigger as the second argument, if I want to. So here I'll use the form data as a first argument, because form data, built with the form data constructor here, is one valid form of provided data to submit. And I don't actually need the second argument to configure it, because there I could change the HTTP method used. I could also change the path the request is sent to if I would want to trigger an action that belongs to a different route. You can, by the way, also do this on form. You can set the action and point to some other route, and then this would not trigger the closest action, but the action that belongs to that route. But I don't want it here. And then by default, just like the form, submit will trigger the closest action. So that's that, and it will return a promise, as you can see, which we can await. And with that, we got a way of submitting this programmatically. And now we could switch from this form here, which I'll comment out, to the standard form and remove method, because I don't want the browser to send any request. Instead, I will add the onSubmit prop and point at my handle submit function so that this function gets triggered. And then here the closing tag, of course, also is no longer form with a capital F, but instead with a lowercase f. And I could do all that to, for example, show a confirmation dialog. So I could say, if confirm, are you sure? Confirm is a function built into the browser, has nothing to do with React or React Router. And confirm will open a little pop-up where I have to confirm my choice. If I click yes, confirm will return true. And in that case, I'll call submit. Otherwise, I won't do anything. So that might be one reason why you do want to do it programmatically. Of course, here we also might want to redirect. And I think you can also call redirect from the client side. You definitely can in the library mode. I'm not sure if it's that redirect function, but I guess the doc should tell us. Navigating, redirect. You can return a redirect. Yeah, can I also do it on the client side though? Oh, yeah, no. I can use the navigate function from use navigate. Good point. So that's another hook provided by React Router, use navigate. Also imported from React Router. And use navigate gives you a navigate function. And you can call that to programmatically navigate the user to a different page. So the same thing clicking a link does, now just done from inside code. So that would be the programmatic way. So therefore now here, if I enter this, I get this confirmation dialog. If I click cancel, nothing happens. But if I click OK, I'm redirected, and theoretically, my post should be created and displayed here. I'll have to investigate why that's not the case. Well, actually, navigating here, by the way, makes no sense. I had a little error here in my thought process. I, of course, still call the action and I redirect there, so I should not need to redirect on the client side. Still good to know how you could do it programmatically, I guess. Now let's see. Yeah, so that's sending, oh, I see. I should add a configuration and set method to post. Otherwise, it will send a GET request to the route that's currently active, and that will of course not trigger the action, because I mentioned actions are triggered for non-GET requests. So again, now that I added this configuration to set the method to post, a post request should be sent. So now if I confirm this, now I'm redirected, and now we can see the new post here. So that's how we can do it programmatically, I guess. Okay, so what else? Oh, I'm already running out of time. I have to go in a couple of minutes. So, but I think we covered a lot of important things here. The next step obviously would be to build like a little more advanced application, maybe in a future stream, because there are more features that are worth exploring. And it is definitely interesting to see React Router work together with authentication and a real database. So yeah, maybe that's something for a future stream. But I think for the basics, that should be a pretty good overview. Obviously, error handling and all that stuff is missing, but the interesting thing is that a lot of the things I showed you here already existed in a similar way since React Router 6.4, and I cover them again in my course, in my book, if you want to get it. But now, with React Router 7, you can continue using them as you did with version 6.4. You can still use React Router as a library, and you can fetch data on the client side there, but you can also use it as a framework, as a replacement for Next.js, and as a full stack framework if you want to fetch data on the server, to mutate data on the server. And that is pretty interesting. And I'll be honest, I have played around a little bit with that framework mode, not too much. I really like it. I like this action loader idea here. As much as I like Next.js, and as much as I like server components and server actions, this approach here, where you kind of decouple your loaders and actions from your components, but at the same time you have them closely co-located and together, I really like that. Because of course in Next.js, you have your data fetching code in your component, or in some function that's called by your component, which is also great. But I like this separation here. Maybe also just because it's the new shiny thing, though it actually isn't. React Router 6.4 and Remix has been around since 2022. And by the way, that's also important. If you've worked with Remix before, this will probably all be fairly familiar. This is probably not too new. The biggest change from Remix probably is the fact that you don't have file-based routing as a default, but that you instead define your routes like this, which might look a bit weird at first. But you can switch back to file-based routing, as I mentioned before. Just search for file-based routing in the official docs, and you'll find the appropriate link. Good. So, thank you all so much for joining. I think that's a great note to end on. Let's see. I'll think of something for the next stream. Maybe build a bit of a more interesting project with React Router. We'll see. There are so many interesting topics. Thank you all so much for being part of the stream. I hope you liked it. You're all awesome. Thank you so much. Have a great day, evening, afternoon, whatever. See you in future streams. Bye.